We're going to do lost wax casting. We're going to make a tree for multiple casts. First thing you do, take the base and weigh it. Oftentimes somebody will have written on the base what it is. Don't trust it. Weigh it yourself. So I'll get a gram scale. This weighs 104 grams. Write it on the bottom. 104 G. B for base. Always weigh the base first. Now, we're going to melt a piece of wax rod into here, just so that it gives us something to put our other waxes onto. I have a little burner that holds methylated spirits that I use to heat my wax carving tool. So I'll just put a little bit of alcohol in here. When you're working with an alcohol flame, be very careful, because it's usually not very visible. Oftentimes it'll burn clear, and if you put this someplace where you can knock it over, it will catch your whole bench on fire quite easily. So I always put mine somewhere where I'm not working. I'll be working here, and with the flame here I won't have a chance of bumping it so that it knocks it over. So I just use this to heat my wax working tool. These are also quite good for burning the hair off your arm, so if you reach across to get something else and you put your hand through the flame, it'll burn the hair off your arm. So once you get this nice and hot, I'm going to just touch it to the wax on the base, touch it to my sprue, and when the two are molten, hold them together. Now when you're working with wax, be careful you don't drop any of this onto your clothing. If you drop it onto your clothing, I don't care what your granny says about ironing with a piece of paper towel or any of the rest of the fixes, once you have wax in your clothing, it's my experience that it's just in your clothing forever. So what I'm going to do now is take all of my wax pieces and I'm going to put them onto my sprue. I'm going to make a tree so that I can do multiple castings on one. What you have to do when you're doing a tree is you have to have 6 millimeters in between each piece, and you have to have 13 millimeters from the top of your flask. So this is our flask that we'll be using. So this has to be 13 millimeters down from the top of this. It has to be 6 millimeters from the side, and it has to have 6 millimeters of space between each piece. If you don't have 6 millimeter spacing, what will happen is the plaster, when you burn the wax out to do your casting, the plaster will drop oftentimes from in between your two waxes, and if the plaster drops out, then you'll just have a solid piece of silver. So we're going to do what they call lost wax casting. So once we get our tree made, which will look like this, so each one of these shells will be an individual shell, but I can just do it all with one casting. So what I'll do now is finish making this tree. So I'll go 33 degrees between these top ones, and then I'll just work my way down until I have all my pieces on the tree. And what you want to do when you're forming a tree is you want to have all of your openings up, because when we cast, we'll be casting down this way, so the silver will come down this pink rod and run into where these are. So the first thing we do is, once we get our tree made, we'll put our flask over it. We make sure that we have 13 millimeters from the top and 6 millimeters from the side. We'll wrap this with masking tape. We'll pour plaster in. When the plaster sets, we'll take the bottom off, take the tape off, put it in the kiln with this end down, and melt all of the wax out. When the wax is all melted out, we'll turn it up this way, put this in a vacuum chamber, so all of these holes will be pulling a vacuum through, and when we cast, we'll cast down this end, because once the plaster is in there and set, we'll pull this rubber base off, and it'll have, where this rounded bit is here, there'll be a funnel in here that we'll pour our metal into. So I'll finish making the tree now, and then we'll invest it. When you've finished making your tree, they call it, because it does look like the branches on a tree. So these are all individual waxes. You slide your casting flask over, have a look to make sure that you have the clearance, 6 mil on the side, 13 from the top. Now you have to weigh it with your waxes on there. So we know the weight of the base. So with the waxes is 117 grams. So we'll also write that on the base. What we have to do now is subtract the 104 from the 117, and that will be the weight of our wax, because we need to know the wax weight of all this so that we can figure out how much silver to melt to do the casting, because you don't want too little, because then it would leave partly uncast. You don't want too much or it'll run over. So once we get our weight, we multiply that weight by 10.4, because a cubic centimeter of silver weighs 10.4 grams. So the weight of this wax will give us the volume of wax. Wax weighs 1, so we'll multiply our wax weight by 10.4, and that'll give us the total number of grams of silver that we need to cast. We have our wax weight now. We can put our flask on, being careful that you don't knock any of the waxes off. So the clearance is nice. At this point, we're going to wrap this with masking tape so that we cover all of these holes, because we're going to pour plaster. Investment is what they call it, but it's a high refractory plaster. It's so that the plaster can handle the temperature that we need to get this up to melt the wax out, and then so that it won't shatter when we pour the molten metal in. blow out your little flame. Put that out of the way. Now just working my way up, making sure that the tape overlaps the other tape. Because with plaster, anywhere there's a little hole, it will find and come out. On our chart, to figure out the volume of plaster and water that we need to mix to fill this, it has different flask sizes. This is a P4 long. The P is for perforated, and the 4 is actually 4 inches in diameter. So all of these are now plugged. Make sure that the base is nice and snug. If it isn't, there are 4 little holes in the base of the flask that you need to tape over. If it's a nice snug fit, leave it alone. So now we need to mix our plaster.